How dare you sue me for the $1 million I left you when I spent $3.5 million just to raise you? The words ripped from my throat in a courtroom so tense it could have snapped under the weight of silence. I remember the gasps, the way the judge's eyebrows arched, the way my children, my own flesh and blood, looked at me with that same blend of shock and contempt that had started this entire nightmare. But what they hadn't expected, what no one in that room expected, was that I wouldn't stop at defending myself. I would countersue, not out of greed, but out of a principle carved deep into my bones. The price of raising ungrateful children comes with receipts. And tis time I had every single one. It hadn't always been like this. Once upon a time, I believed love was enough. I believed that sacrificing everything, my money, my health, my time, would create children who would stand by me when the years bent my spine and softened my face. I was wrong. The beginning of this story, like most tragedies, is deceptively ordinary. A modest house, laughter spilling through the walls, the chaotic dance of bills and bedtime stories. Their mother was gone by the time they were barely out of diapers, leaving me with 2 screaming toddlers and no manual on how to transform despair into stability. I remember tucking them in on nights I hadn't eaten myself, whispering, "Don't worry, Daddy's got you," though I wasn't sure how much longer I had anything at all. The cost of childcare alone drained me faster than any mortgage payment. I worked 2 jobs, then 3, sometimes grabbing only a couple hours of sleep in the cab of my truck between shifts. When daycare turned into private school because they cried about being bullied in the public one, I bit down on my pride and found the money. "You can't afford this," my brother warned when he saw the tuition slips. "I can't afford not to," I shot back. They deserve better than I ever had. And so it began, a steady hemorrhage of money for their clothes, their activities, their endless dreams, ballet lessons, football camps, orthodontist bills, tutors when their grades slipped, even therapy when the teenage storms began to rage. I never said no. Not on say every please. That became another check written, another corner of my life shaved down until there was nothing left of me but the wallet I kept reaching into. But gratitude, that never came. Instead, entitlement bloomed like weeds in a garden I once believed was beautiful. By the time they reached their 20s, the children I raised with sweat and sacrifice had become strangers. I watched them spend without thought, mocked the very work ethic that had kept them clothed and fed. And when I grew tired, when I finally slowed down enough to sit at the dinner table instead of always working, I noticed their eyes didn't even meet mine anymore. The rift turned into a canyon the day their grandmother passed. She left me her house, a place that carried memories thicker than blood. I knew they expected it to go straight to them, as though inheritance was their birthright, not a gift. When I announced my plans to sell it, to cover my own retirement, finally, their fury erupted. "You're stealing from us?" My eldest son spat, his face twisted with the same rage I once saw when he was a toddler denied a toy. "I gave you everything," I said, quiet but steady. "This is mine. I earned the right to rest." It wasn't enough for them. They took me to court. Their claim as vicious as it was absurd, that I'd mismanaged their inheritance, that the $1 million estate should be theirs by blood. Blood. As if blood ever paid the bills. The first day in court, I listened in silence as they painted me as selfish, a miser who hoarded money while they supposedly suffered. Safardam private school, playgrounds, embraces, at football fields. With $1,000 gear, the bile rose in my throat, but I swallowed it. Because I knew my turn was coming, and when it did, I stood taller than I had in years. They say I owe them $1 million. I say they owe me $3.5 million. Every dollar it took to raise them, documented, accounted for, signed, sealed, undeniable. My lawyer dropped a binder thick as a brick onto the table. Tuition receipts, medical bills, grocery expenses, all of it painstakingly preserved because some part of me had always known this day might come. Gasps filled the room as page after page turned. My youngest daughter's face flushed red. "You can't put a price on love!" she screamed. "You're right," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of it. "And yet you did the moment you sued me." The room fell silent. the air heavy with truths no one wanted to hear. The judge leaned forward, his pen tapping against the bench, eyes narrowing not at me, but at them. The tide had turned, and my children were drowning in the flood of their own greed. And still, even then, I wasn't sure I wanted to win. Because what is victory when it means proving to the world that your children see you as nothing more than a bank account? But as I looked into their cold, furious eyes, I realized the truth. I had already lost him. Winning the case was the only way to make sure I didn't lose myself too. It was in those hours on the stand that the years unspooled like a film reel. The Christmas mornings, I stayed awake for 3 nights straight just to afford the gifts. The nights in hospital waiting rooms. The time I sold my truck so my son could have a car for college. I laid it all bare, not for pity, but because they needed to hear the story of the man behind the money. Why? The judge finally asked, his tone softer than I expected. Why keep all these records? I took a deep breath. Because love without proof gets twisted. I knew one day they'd forget. I didn't want the world to. For a moment, the courtroom was silent except for the rustle of papers, the weight of generations pressing against the walls. My children wouldn't to meet my eyes, and maybe that was for the best. If they had, they might have seen what they had taken from me, the belief that love alone could ever be enough. But as the gavel came down, as the murmurs swelled into gasps, I knew one thing with certainty. Sometimes the cruelest thing a parent can do is keep the receipts. The verdict was like a thunderclap splitting the air. My countersuit was upheld. The judge ruled in my favor, acknowledging not only the absurdity of their claims, but the staggering weight of the evidence I had laid out. $3.5 million. It wasn't just a number. It was the sum of 2 decades of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and every quiet decision to put their happiness above my own survival. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Lawyers shuffling papers, reporters scribbling notes like vultures circling a battlefield. My children, my once beloved children, sat frozen, as if they had been struck down by lightning they never saw coming. For a brief moment, I thought I would feel triumph, that winning would taste sweet, a vindication of every hardship. Instead, it tasted like ash. As the judge's gavel echoed its final blow, all I felt was a cavernous emptiness. My lawyer patted my shoulder, whispering, "You did it. You've won." But what had I really won? When we stepped out into the courthouse steps, cameras flashed like fireworks. Reporters crowded in, microphones shoved at my face. "Sir, how does it feel to countersue your own children? Do you think this will set a precedent for other parents? Do you regret it?" I looked past the blur of faces, searching for the ones I had once waited for outside school gates, the ones I had rocked to sleep. They stood off to the side, huddled together, whispering furiously. My eldest finally caught my gaze, his face a mask of bitterness. "You ruined us," he hissed when we passed too close. "No," I answered, my voice low but steady. "I just showed the world the truth." They turned away, their backs as sharp as knives. I knew in that instant that I would never again be called Dad with love in their voices. That word had died in that courtroom, buried beneath stacks of receipts. The weeks that followed blurred together, a storm of headlines and lawsuits dissected on morning talk shows. Strangers sent me letters, some condemning me as a heartless monster, others praising me as a hero for standing against entitlement. None of it mattered. The house was quieter than ever, filled with a silence so suffocating it pressed against my chest like a stone. I found myself wandering through old photo albums, the edges worn soft from years of turning pages. There they were, sticky fingers gripping popsicles, Halloween costumes too big for their tiny bodies, braces flashing behind awkward smiles. I traced their faces with trembling fingers, whispering to no one. Where did I go wrong? One night, long past midnight, the phone rang. For a moment my heart leapt, foolishly hoping it was one of them. Instead, it was my lawyer. "They're appealing," he said bluntly. Of course they were. The wound wasn't deep enough yet. They wanted to twist the knife. We went back to court, round after round. Each hearing chipped away at the remnants of what little relationship was left. They came armed with new arguments, new accusations. That I manipulated them, that I exaggerated costs, that I had used them as pawns in some grotesque vendetta. I sat through it all, listening to their voices I once would have given my life to protect turned sharp, cruel, unrecognizable. At one point, during a recess, my youngest daughter approached me in the hallway. For the first time since it all began, there were tears in her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. My chest tightened. "Because you left me no choice." Her lip trembled, but then she hardened. "We just wanted what was ours." I leaned closer, my voice breaking. "You already had what was yours. 20 years of it. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every meal I skipped so you could eat, that was yours. But you threw it away." She turned and walked off, her heels echoing down the hall, each step like a nail hammered into the coffin of our bond. When the appeal finally collapsed under the weight of reality, the judgment stood. I kept the estate, I kept the proof of my sacrifices, and I carried the hollow victory home with me, where it sat on the mantle like a trophy I never wanted. But life, I discovered, doesn't stop for broken hearts. The world kept turning. I started to rebuild not with money, but at week time. I planted a garden out back, something I'd never had the luxury to do before. I reconnected with old friends, the ones I'd neglected during the years when my entire existence revolved around being both father and mother. Slowly, I began to feel human again. Not just a provider whose worth was measured in dollars, yet the absence of my children was a ghost that haunted every room. Holidays came and went without phone calls. Birthdays passed like any other day. I told myself I had made peace, but at night, lying in bed, the silence screamed louder than any courtroom ever had. Then, months later, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen since high school report cards came home. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It read, "Asterisk, we never asked you to keep the receipts. Maybe that's where it all went wrong." Asterisk, I sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at the words until they blurred into nothing. I didn't know if it was an olive branch or another wound, but I knew one thing. No matter how much money the court had ruled in my favor, the true debt could never be repaid. And as I folded the letter back into its envelope, I whispered to the empty house. Neither could the love. I kept that letter tucked inside the same binder of receipts that had won me the case. It felt symbolic somehow, like placing their words alongside the proof of my sacrifices. Balanced the scales between what was said and what was done. Sometimes I'd take it out late at night, the silence pressing too hard on my chest, and run my thumb over the uneven strokes of the pen. Asterisk, we never asked you to keep the receipts. Asterisk, the words cut deeper than any courtroom accusation ever had. But maybe they were right. Maybe I had been keeping those receipts not only to protect myself, but also to prove something to them, to the world, maybe even to myself. Was love genuine if it had to be documented? Had I let my fear of being forgotten twist into an obsession with proof? One afternoon, as autumn leaves painted the streets in fire and gold, I received an unexpected visitor. My brother, who'd kept his distance through the whole trial, showed up at my door with 2 cups of coffee and a look that said he was carrying more than caffeine. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. "Doors open," I said, though my voice lacked warmth. The next morning, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with pen and paper, staring at 2 blank envelopes. I didn't know if my other children would ever be ready to knock on my door, but I knew I had more letters to write, more truths to share, because the real receipts weren't the ones in binders or courtrooms. They were the stories, the sacrifices, the unseen love carried in every decision. And maybe, just maybe, those were the only receipts that could ever bring my family back. As I pressed pen to paper again, I whispered into the quiet, "This time, I'll keep the right ones." The pen hovered over the page longer than I'd expected. Writing that first letter had poured out of me like a dam breaking. But now that I knew one of them had read it, asterisk, felled asterisk. The weight of these next words felt even heavier. What could I say to my eldest son, the one whose face hardened into stone in the courtroom, who told me I had ruined him? What could I say to the middle child, who would scream that you can't put a price on love, only to drag me into court demanding exactly that? I began slowly, hand trembling. Asterisk, to my son. Asterisk, I wrote. Asterisk, you think I chose money over you? The truth is, I chose you over money every single time. Every dollar I earned could have gone to Makud, have gone to a safer car, a healthier life, a home without constant debt, but I gave it to you instead. I don't regret that. What I regret is not showing you the cost. I regret letting you believe that love was easy, when in truth it demanded everything of me. I don't want your forgiveness. I want your understanding. If you can't give me that now, I'll keep hoping you will someday. Asterisk the words. Bled onto the page, raw and unpolished, but real. When I finished, I folded the letter and slid it into the envelope addressed with his name. For my middle child, my daughter. The words came differently. Asterisk, you told me I can't put a price on love. You were right, but neither can you sue for it. What I did wasn't about money, it was about fighting for the truth. The truth that I gave you, my best, even when it broke me. I didn't want the court to believe I was selfish. I wanted you to remember that I wasn't. If you hate me for how I proved it, so be it. But hate me for what I did not, for what I never stopped feeling for you. Asterisk, by the time I finished, the sun was high, and the house felt warmer, as though the act of writing had pushed back the cold that had settled since the trial. I sealed both letters and set them beside the binder, unsure when or if I'd mail them. That evening. The phone rang again. I hesitated, expecting it to be a solicitor. But when I answered, my brother's voice crackled through. She came to see you, didn't she? I smiled faintly. How did you know? She called me, said she cried the whole way home. Said maybe she finally understood you. I leaned against the counter, heart heavier and lighter all at once. It's a start, I murmured. He paused, then said, the others might come around. Give it time. Just don't stop reaching out. Don't let pride get in the way now. Pride. That was the thing that had kept me alive in court, but might kill me in life if I wasn't too careful. After the call, I went out to the garden. The soil I had planted months ago was finally sprouting green. Small shoots pushing through the dirt. I knelt down, brushing the tender leaves with my fingers. And it struck me how much raising children was like tending a garden. You pour yourself into the ground, water it, nurture it, fight off the storms. And sometimes, despite everything, the blooms don't come when you expect them. Sometimes, they take years. Sometimes, they never come at all. But that night, as I looked at the fragile green breaking through the soil, I realized something. Just because it takes longer doesn't mean it isn't growing. And maybe just may be the same was true for my children. So I left the porch light on, a small beacon in the night. Not as a father waiting to scold, not as a man keeping score, but as someone who was finally ready to welcome them home whenever they chose to return. And in that quiet moment, I whispered into the dark, I'll be here. Always. With or without the receipts. The porch light burned night after night, a silent signal against the dark. Sometimes, I caught myself staring at it from the living room chair, as though the bulb itself held the power to pull it back to me. Weeks passed. My youngest daughter called a few times, always cautious, as if testing the ground she walked on. Each conversation chipped away at the wall between us, revealing glimpses of the little girl who once clung to my hand at the grocery store, who once begged me for just one more bedtime story. But the other silence, letters, unacknowledged. No phone calls, no footsteps on the porch, until one Saturday afternoon. The sound of gravel crunching outside pulled me from the kitchen. Through the window, I saw a car door slam, then another. My eldest son, my middle daughter. Together, my heart kicked against my ribs, fear and hope warring inside me. They didn't knock. They stood on the porch, hesitant, arms crossed like soldiers preparing for battle. I opened the door slowly, the warm air spilling out to meet them. We got your letters, my son said flatly. His voice carried no warmth, but no venom either. I nodded, gripping the doorframe for strength, and my daughter's eyes flicked away, restless. We're not here to forgive you. Not yet. I didn't ask for forgiveness, I said, only understanding. There was a pause, heavy and uncertain. Then my son thrust a crumpled sheet of paper toward me. "We made our own receipts," he said. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It wasn't financial records, it was a list. Memories scribbled in their handwriting. Asterisk. You missed my science fair. Asterisk. Asterisk. You weren't there when I had my first heartbreak. Asterisk. Asterisk. You worked every birthday. Asterisk. Asterisk. You never came to my championship game. Asterisk. Each line was a dagger, sharp with truth. My chest tightened as I read. When I looked up, both of them were staring at me. Waiting maybe? Hoping to see if I'd deny it? I didn't. You're right, I said softly, the words breaking me open. I failed you in ways I can't undo. I thought giving you everything you wanted would make up for not being there. I thought money could be love if I gave enough of it. But I see now that all you wanted was me. My daughter's lip trembled, but she stayed silent. My son clenched his jaw, the paper still in his hand. You were never just receipts to me, I whispered. You were my reason for breathing. But in trying to give you more than I ever had, I gave you less of what you needed most. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The wind rustled the trees, and somewhere down the road a dog barked, life going on as though the world wasn't balanced on this fragile edge. Finally, my son lowered his eyes. We're not saying we can forget, but maybe we can try. It was no victory, no neat conclusion. But it was something. A crack in the wall, a chance. Then let's try, I said, stepping back from the door. Come inside. We don't need to settle it today. Just let's sit together, like family. They hesitated, exchanging a glance, then crossed the threshold. For the first time in years, my house held the weight of their presence, not as plaintiffs or enemies, but as children who were finally willing to look me in the eye. We sat at the table, the same one that had once been covered in receipts and letters, now cleared and waiting. The conversation was awkward at first, full of long pauses and half-finished thoughts, but slowly, the edges soft. My daughter laughed at a memory of her sister spilling juice all over the Christmas tree, and for a fleeting second, the sound filled the room with something almost like the past. And as I listened, I realized something important. Reconciliation doesn't come in sweeping victories or dramatic apologies. It comes in the quiet moments and open door, a shared laugh, the decision to sit together despite the weight of everything broken. The porch light stayed on that night, but for the first time, it wasn't a beacon for the lost. It was a welcome home for the ones who had finally begun to find their way back. That night stretched on longer than I expected. We sat at the table, trading fragments of stories, cautious words weaving a fragile bridge. My eldest barely spoke, but his silence was different, now not cold, not hostile. It was listening silence. My daughter, braver with words, filled the gaps. She tested me with memories of missed moments, and I didn't deflect. I let every regret land where it belonged. When the clock crept past midnight, she yawned, covering her mouth like she used to when she was 10. My son pushed his chair back, his face unreadable. You know, this doesn't fix everything, he said quietly. I know, I answered, but nothing gets fixed if we don't start somewhere. He nodded, almost imperceptibly, then glanced around the house as though he were rediscovering it. His eyes lingered on the family photos still hanging on the wall, me holding him in a hospital blanket, the three of them grinning with gap-toothed smiles, their mother's face only in the oldest frame. His jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. They left with no promises, no hugs, no declarations of love, just a murmured goodnight from my daughter and a long stare from my son that felt like an unfinished sentence. Yet as their car pulled away, I stood in the doorway and realized my chest felt lighter than it had in years. The days after were a strange mix of waiting and living. I still watered the garden, still brewed my morning coffee, still sat in the chair by the window each evening. But now there was a flicker of expectation in every quiet moment, like the pause before a second knock. It came a week later, not at my door, but through the phone. My son's voice, clipped but steady. Dear, I've been thinking. I held my breath. We were angry because we thought you chose money over us. But maybe we were angry because you never chose asterisk yourself asterisk either. You gave everything until there was nothing left of you. Maybe that's why we couldn't see you as a father. Because you were always just Gone. Gone. His words were a blade and a bomb at once. You're right, I admitted. I thought love meant emptying myself completely, but I see now it left us all emptier than it should have. There was a long pause. Then, I don't forgive you. Not yet, but I don't hate you anymore either. For me, that was enough. As weeks turned into months, the cracks widened into doorways. My youngest visited often, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just herself. My daughter began sending texts short, sharp, butters. My son called now and then, and though his words were stiff, his presence alone was a gift. The three of them never came together. Not yet. There was still too much history between them. Too many jagged edges, but individually, they began to step into my life again, like pieces of a puzzle slowly learning where they belonged. One Sunday afternoon, as I tended the garden, my youngest appeared on the porch holding a casserole dish. She set it down and smirked. Don't get used to it. I'm not turning into mom. I laughed, really laughed, the kind that shook years of dust off my chest. Later, as we ate together at the table, she said quietly, You know, Dad, maybe keeping the receipts wasn't the mistake. Maybe the mistake was waiting until a courtroom to show them. If we'd seen them sooner, maybe we'd have understood sooner. Her words lingered long after she left. Maybe she was right. Maybe love shouldn't wait for desperation to be explained. That night, I pulled the binder from the shelf again. But this time, I didn't look at it as a weapon or a ledger. I saw it for what it truly was, a storybook. Each receipt was a page, each dollar a sentence, in the story of how I had tried imperfectly, desperately, completely to love them. And as I turned the pages, I realized that someday, when the time was right, I'd de-sit them all down and tell the story the way it was meant to be told. Not as evidence, not as debt, but as a father's testament that love had always been there, even when it was invisible. For now, though, I left the porch light on again, not as a beacon this time, but as a promise that no matter how long it took, the door would always be open. And maybe, just maybe, someday they'd walk through it together. The seasons turned, one after another, as though time itself was testing whether the fragile peace would hold. Winter came with quiet mornings and long nights, the kind that pressed old regrets against the windows like frost. Spring followed, and with it came small rituals, phone calls from my daughter every Sunday evening, my youngest dropping by with a quick laugh, my son's rare but steady cheek. Each of them was still carrying their own storms, but for the first time in years, I felt the clouds thinning. The garden grew fuller, too. What had once been barren soil now swelled with vegetables and bright blooms. Neighbors passing by would stop to admire it, unaware that every stem, every leaf, felt to me like a piece of healing breaking through the dirt. I began to invite my youngest to help plant, teaching her how to press seeds into the soil with patience. Sometimes she rolled her eyes, joking, "This feels like therapy, Dad." Maybe it was. Then came summer, and with it, the first gathering that felt like family again. It wasn't planned. My daughter stopped by to return a book I'd lent her. My youngest was already there, helping me trim tomato vines. And then, as if fate wanted to test us, my son's car rolled into the driveway. He stepped out, stiff as ever, but he didn't turn around when he saw his sisters. He gave me a nod, then walked up to the porch. For a moment, none of us moved. Three siblings who had stood together in a courtroom against me now stood together in front of my home. The weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the humid air. "Want some iced tea?" I asked, voice steadier than I felt. It was the smallest of olive branches, but sometimes the smallest things open the largest doors. We ended up at the dining table again, 4 glasses sweating with condensation, conversation halting and uneven. They bickered with each other at first, old tensions flaring, but slowly the edges softened. My youngest teased my son about his stubbornness. My daughter sighed and rolled her eyes, and for a brief flicker of time, it felt like years had melted away. And then my son said it, not loudly, not dramatically, just a muttered truth between sips of tea. I still don't forgive you, but maybe I want to. The room went still. My daughters stared at him, then at me. My throat tightened, but I didn't push, didn't demand more than he could give. He only nodded. That's enough, I said softly. We sat there until the sun dipped below the horizon, shadows stretching across the table where we had once only laid out accusations and receipts. Now, for the first time in too long, it held something gentler. The fragile possibility of family. When they left that evening, they didn't drive away separately. My daughters got into his car, and together they disappeared down the road. That, more than anything, told me something had shifted. Later that night, I stood at the doorway, staring at the porch light glowing, steady in the dark. It had started as a beacon for reconciliation, then as a promise of patience. But now, as I looked out into the quiet street, I realized it had become something else entirely. It was no longer just for them. It was for me, too. A reminder that love, though battered and bruised, still had a place in this house. That despite courtrooms and betrayals, despite years lost to anger and silence, the story wasn't over yet. And as the warm light spilled across the threshold, I whispered into the night, "Come home. Whenever you're ready, the door will be open." For the first time, I truly believed they just might. Autumn came again, crisp air filling the house through open windows, carrying with it the smell of burning leaves and the faint sound of children playing down the street. I found myself standing at the window more often, watching those children chase each other across yards, their laughter piercing me with both memory and longing. Once, not so long ago, those voices had belonged to my own. But this autumn was different. For the first time since the trial, my house wasn't just a place of silence, it was beginning to hold echoes again. My youngest had taken to visiting every week, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but her chatter. My daughter texted more frequently. Little things, photos of her coffee, complaints about work. Even Ayud liked this song message that nearly brought me to tears. And my son though still got it cold every so often to check on the garden, as if the tomatoes were a safe way to talk about anything but us. It was a slow thaw, but a thaw nonetheless. Then, on a chilly Saturday evening, they all came together without planning, without ceremony. My youngest had invited her siblings, telling neither of them the other would be there. When I opened the door, all three stood awkwardly on the porch, as if the world itself had conspired to force the confrontation we'd all been avoiding. I swallowed hard. "Well," I said, stepping aside, "you might as well come in. No sense freezing out there." They shuffled into the living room, the air thick with unease. My son leaned against the wall, arms crossed. My daughter perched on the edge of the couch. My youngest plopped into the armchair, too stubborn to let the tension suffocate her. For a long time, none of us spoke. Then my daughter sighed, running a hand through her hair. "This feels weird," she muttered. My youngest smirked. "Weird's better than suing each other." That cracked the silence. My son actually let out a short, laughed cry, reluctant, but real. I felt the sound ripple through the room like a fragile thread stitching us together. We ended up ordering takeout. The four of us gathered around the table with cartons of noodles and fried rice, chopsticks clicking against plastic containers. Conversation came in fits and starts. Safe topics at first, then memories creeping in. "Remember when Dad tried to fix the roof himself and fell through the attic?" My youngest grinned. My son chuckled. He swore for an hour straight. I thought the neighbors were gonna call the cops. Even I laughed, though my ribs ached with the old embarrassment. And who had to fix the hole? Me. With duct tape and plywood. The laughter grew, tentative but real, spilling into stories I thought had been lost to bitterness. For one night, we weren't adversaries. We weren't estranged. We were just a family again, sitting in the soft glow of the dining room light, our anger momentarily eclipsed by something warmer. When the night wound down and they prepared to leave, my daughter lingered by the door. She looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen in years softer, searching. "Dad," she said quietly, "we can't undo what happened. But maybe we can stop letting it define us." I felt something inside me loosen, a knot that had strangled me for too long. "That's all I've ever wanted," I whispered. They drove away together that night, their car disappearing into the dark. I stood at the doorway long after, the porch light spilling across the steps. It no longer felt like a lonely beacon, it felt like a welcome sign, a quiet promise that the house wasn't just mine anymore. And for the first time since the trial began, I let myself believe. We hadn't lost everything. Something, however small, had survived. Something worth tending. Like the garden out back, fragile and stubborn, love had begun to grow again. Winter returned, but this time, the cold didn't feel so crushing. The house, once hollow as a grave, began to breathe again. Not with daily noise not yet, but with the rhythm of visits, calls, and hesitant laughter that stitched itself back into the walls. Christmas was the true test. For years, it had been the loneliest day of my life. A cruel reminder of everything broken. That morning, I almost didn't put up the tree. The box of ornaments sat untouched in the attic, dust thick on the lid. But as the afternoon sun slanted through the window, I climbed the ladder and dragged it down. Piece by piece, I decorated the tree, hanging old ornaments with shaky Hensta paper stars my kids had met in grade school. The faded angel their mother once insisted on placing at the top. I didn't expect company. I decorated for myself, to remind the house of better days. So when a knock came that evening, I froze. 3 shadows stood on the porch, their breath visible in the icy air. My children, all of them. Together. My youngest grinned. "We thought maybe you shouldn't spend Christmas alone this year." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I stepped aside, and they filed in, stamping snow from their boots. The warmth of the tree's lights reflected in their faces, softening the years of bitterness that had carved them hard. We sat in the living room, exchanging gifts none of us had expected. My youngest handed me a photo album, old pictures she'd salvaged, arranged with captions. My daughter brought a pie she'd baked, joking that it was edible. Probably. And my son, my silent, stubborn son, handed me a small wooden box. Inside was a set of gardening tools, polished and new. "You keep talking about that garden," he muttered, almost embarrassed. "Figured you could use something better than a rusty trowel." I swallowed hard, my voice unsteady. "Thank you, all of you." The evening passed, not in grand declarations, but in small, steady step stories shared, memories unburied, silences that no longer felt hostile but reflective. When midnight came, we stood together by the tree, the glow painting their faces in gold. My daughter turned to me then, eyes wet but steady. "Dad, I don't know if we'll ever fix everything, but tonight I remembered what it felt like to be family. I want that again, even if it takes time." I reached out, pulling her into my arms, then my youngest. Then finally my son, stiff at first, but eventually he leaned into the embrace. For the first time in years, I held them all at once. The house, which had once echoed with nothing but silence and grief, was full again. Full of warmth, of possibility, of a love battered but not destroyed. That night, after they left, I stood by the window watching the snow fall softly over the garden. The porch light glowed steady, no longer a desperate beacon but a symbol of something returned. And in that quiet moment, I realized the truth I had fought so long to prove. Love can't be measured in receipts or verdicts. Love is measured in moments like these. Fragile, fleeting, but worth everything. The battle had cost us years, scars, and trust. But standing in the glow of the Christmas tree, I knew one thing for certain. We were finding our way back. Not as plaintiff and defendants. Not as judge and judged, but as father and children at last. Would you like me to take the story beyond reconciliation into what their relationship looks like years later? When time has either healed or reopened old wounds, the years began to move with a gentler rhythm after that Christmas. Reconciliation wasn't Sedonit. It was more like learning to walk again, after forgetting how. Some days were steady, others stumbled, but we kept moving forward. Spring came, and with it, my son appeared at the garden gate one Saturday morning. He didn't knock or call ahead, he just walked in, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the rows of green. "Need help?" he asked. I nearly dropped the watering can. "Always," I said, pretending my voice hadn't cracked. We worked side by side in silence, pulling weeds, staking vines. He didn't talk much, but the act itself spoke louder than words. For hours, the rhythm of digging and planting filled the space where arguments once had. When he left that evening, dirt smudged across his shirt. He said quietly, "See you next week." And he did come back. Again and again. Each visit, the wall between us thinned. By summer, we were talking about things other than the past, the weather, the news, even his job. One afternoon, he picked a ripe tomato and bit into it, juice running down his chin. For the first time in years, I saw him grin like the boy he used to be. My daughter was slower to return, but she did. She called more often, then began inviting me to her home for dinners. At first, I declined, afraid of overstepping. But eventually I went, sitting at her table, listening to her talk about her life. I realized she wasn't just my daughter anymore, she was her own person, strong and capable. For the first time, I felt pride not just for what I had given her, but for who she had become, despite everything. And my youngest, she never left my side. She became the bridge between us all, stubbornly pulling us together when we might have drifted apart again. She organized family dinners, game nights, even convinced us all to spend Thanksgiving together. It was awkward, yes, but also healing. One Thanksgiving evening, as we sat around the table, full of turkey and pie, my son put down his fork and said, almost to himself, "You know, I think I forgive you." The words weren't loud. They weren't dramatic, but they silenced the room. My eyes stung as I nodded, too choked to speak. From that moment, something shifted. We weren't just trying anymore. We were doing. Years spaced. Passing. The garden grew with me, season after season, its soil rich with memory. Sometimes the kids helped. Sometimes they just visited to sit and talk. Birthdays were no longer missed. Holidays no longer lonely. We never spoke much about the trial anymore. It hung in the air, like an old scavisible, but no longer bleeding. Then one summer evening, while fireflies danced over the garden, my youngest sat beside me on the porch. "You know, Dad," she said, "maybe keeping the receipts wasn't a mistake after all." I chuckled softly. "Oh, really? After all that?" She nodded, smiling. "Yeah, because without them, we might never have learned what we almost lost." The truth of it settled deep in me. The receipts hadn't destroyed us. They'd forced us to face what lay beneath them. As night fell and the porch light flickered on, I realized the house wasn't just mine anymore. It was ours again, not the same as before. Maybe never the same, but enough. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a man who had won a case. I felt like a father who had finally, against all odds, won back his family. Would you like me to close this story here with a definitive, bittersweet ending, or expand further into their later lives, showing how this reconciliation shapes the rest of their years? The years unspooled like thread, weaving a fabric I'd once thought forever torn. What began as fragile steps toward reconciliation grew into something sturdier, though never perfect. Families, I learned, don't mend into what they once were, they become something new, stitched together by scars as much as by love. By the time I turned 70, the garden had become the heart of our reunions. My children grown, busy, shaped by their own lives, still akin back to this patch of earth. My son especially. He had inherited my stubbornness, my silence, even my way of working with his hands. Together we built a small greenhouse one summer, sweating side by side in the heat. He rarely spoke about feelings, but every nail he hammered, every beam he lifted, felt like an apology neither of us needed to voice. My middle daughter began to bring her kids. The first time she placed my granddaughter in my arms, we met in air. I wept. The child's tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and in that moment, I saw a chance for everything to be different. My daughter watched with cautious eyes, as if afraid to let me too close. But over the years, even her wariness softened. My youngest never married, but she was my fiercest companion. She called me almost daily, sometimes just to ask how the tomatoes were doing, sometimes to remind me to take my medicine. When I teased her for fussing too much, she smirked and said, "You raised us with receipts. Dad, I'm raising you with reminders." It was sent. Eloise, you see, Old resentments resurfaced now and then. Sharp words cutting into otherwise peaceful dinners. Sometimes my son would storm out, or my daughter would fall quiet, retreating into old patterns. But now, instead of months or years of silence, they always came back. That was the difference. We'd learned that walking away wasn't the answer. One summer evening, we gathered in the garden for my birthday. The grandchildren played among the rows, chasing fireflies, their laughter filling the dusk. My son grilled steaks, my daughter set the table, and I sat back, watching them all, my chest swelling with something I hadn't felt in decades. Peace. When the cake came out lopsided, too many candles, the kids insisted I make a wish. I closed my eyes, the warm night air heavy with the smell of grass and charcoal. My wish was simple, that this fragile, imperfect, miraculous second chance would last. As the candles flickered out, I realized something. The lawsuit, the bitterness, the years of silence, they would always be part of our story. But so would this, the laughter, the shared meals, the hands digging in the dirt together. We weren't defined by what broke us. We were defined by the choice to keep rebuilding, over and over. Years later, when my hair was white and my hands too shaky to garden alone, it was my children who tended the soil. My son taught his boy how to stake tomatoes. My daughters pulled weeds, their children trailing behind them with muddy shoes. And I sat on the porch, watching the porch light glowing above me, not as a beacon anymore, but as a witness to the fact that love, no matter how bruised, had survived. And in the end, that was worth far more than any inheritance, any lawsuit, any sum of money ever could be. Would you like me to write a true asterisk closing chapter, asterisk 40 saga, an epilogue that shows the very end of the father's life, and how his children finally see the receipts for what they really were? The years rolled on, and the garden bore witness to them all. Seasons came and went, like breath spring's tender shoots. Summer's heavy fruit, autumn's dying leaves, winter's brittle silence. My body slowed with each cycle, but the soil still pulled me out every morning, reminding me I was alive. It was in that garden, one late autumn evening, that I felt the weight of age truly settle on me. My knees ached, my back bent lower than ever, and I realized I could no longer keep up with the rows the way I once had. My son noticed first. Without a word, he started showing up twice a week, tools in hand, taking over the heavier work. "Sit down, Dad," he'd say. "Just tell me what needs doing." And so I did. Watching him work, I realized the roles had reversed. The boy I once carried on my shoulders now carried me in his weight. Every time he bent a weed or hammered a new frame for the greenhouse, I saw what the courtroom years had tried to erase. The bond between us, still alive, still stubborn. By the time I turned 80, my health had begun to falter. Hospital visits became common. My daughters took shifts driving me, arguing over who would bring dinner, who would stay the night. The same children who once accused me of selfishness now fought over who would give more of themselves. It broke me open in ways no verdict ever could. One night, as I lay in a hospital bed, machines humming around me, they all came together. My youngest sat closest, her hand wrapped around mine. My daughter stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaking her cheeks. My son sat stiff in the corner, but his eyes never left me. I kept the receipts, I whispered, my voice thin but steady. Not to prove what you owed me, but to prove I never stopped loving you, even when I didn't know how to show it right. For the first time, none of them flinched at the word asterisk receipts. Asterisk. My son's jaw tightened, but instead of anger, there was grief. In his eyes, my daughter leaned closer. "We know, Dad. We know now." Silence filled the room, not the cold silence of estrangement, but the heavy, sacred silence of truth, finally spoken. I passed not long after, in that same bed, with their hands on me, their voices whispering love into the dim light. Afterward, when they returned to the house, they found the old binder still on the shelf. My youngest opened it, and instead of hiding it away, she laid it on the dining table. Together, they turned the pages not as evidence, not as debt, but as a chronicle of love. Grocery bills, tuition checks, hospital receipts. Every slip of paper became a memory, a story, a testament. At the very back of the binder, they found my final letter. One I had written years earlier and tucked away. Asterisk, to my children. If you are reading this, I am gone. Don't think of these receipts as proof of what you cost me. Think of them as proof of what you were worth. Every dollar, every hour, every sacrifice. It was never about the money. It was about, they read it together. Tears falling on the pages for the first time. The binder didn't feel like a weapon. It felt like a gift. And so they closed it, not with bitterness, but with reverence. The porch light still burned that night, casting its glow across the steps. This time, it wasn't waiting for me to welcome them. It was waiting for them, reminding them that love, however flawed, had always been there, quiet, steady, and unbroken. And though I was gone, my children finally understood. The receipts had never been about debt. They had been about devotion, and in the end, that was the only inheritance that mattered. Would you like me to expand even further into how the children's lives unfolded afterward, carrying both the scars and the lessons of their father's love? After the funeral, the house didn't fall silent the way I once feared it would. Instead, it came alive in a new way. My children, my grown, weathered children began to gather there. Not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was love rediscovered too late to give back to me. Whatever it was, it kept them returning to the home they had once tried to take from me. The binder never left the dining table. At first, they kept it open like a shrine. The pages spread with receipts of every sacrifice I had made. Over time, they added their own. Not bills, but mementos, photographs of birthdays, notes scribbled on napkins, drawings from grandchildren. What began as proof of the past became a living record of the present. Their way of continuing the story I had started. My son took over the garden, the first spring after my passing. He stood at the soil with his own boy at his side. "This was your grandfather's pride," he told him, pressing seeds into the dirt with calloused fingers. "He taught me everything here, even when I didn't want to learn. Now I'm teaching you." It became their ritual, the two of them side by side in the rows of tomatoes, carrying forward what had once reconciled a father and son divided. My middle daughter found her healing in words. She began to write essays, journals, letters she never sent. Some she tucked into the binder. Others she read aloud to her children, explaining the complicated man their grandfather had been. "He loved us, the only way he knew how," she told them one night, her voice breaking. "And it took us too long to see it, but we do now." My youngest, ever the bridge, became the keeper of the house. She refused to let it go, insisting it stay in the family. "This isn't just property," she told her siblings when they suggested selling it. "It's where we lost him, and where we found him again." Every holiday, she kept the porch light on, welcoming her brother and sister, their children, even neighbors who drifted in. She made the home what I always dreamed it would be. A place where love could return, no matter how far it strayed. Over the years, their children grew, carrying stories of a grandfather they remembered not for courtrooms or lawsuits, but for the garden, the porch light, and the binder of receipts that became a family heirloom. The bitterness of the past faded, replaced by the lesson etched into every page. Love is costly, yes, but it is also priceless. One summer evening, long after my passing, they gathered again in the garden. My grandchildren ran through rows of beans and corn, laughter filling the air. My children sat on the porch, older now, softened by time. The binder sat between them on the table, its pages worn, edges frayed, but still intact. My son traced his hand over it and said quietly, "You know, I think Dad was right all along. Love does leave receipts. We just didn't know how to read them." They fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Then my daughter leaned back, watching the children play. "At least we learned," she said. "Even if it was late, we'll learned." And as the porch light flickered on, bathing the yard in warm glow, they understood the legacy I had left behind. Not money, not property, but proof undeniable. Proof that love, Duke Flauet, though imperfect, had been there all along. The receipts had told their story. Now, it was theirs to carry forward. Do you want me to close the saga here as a final, definitive epilogue? Would you like me to follow into the grandchildren's lives, showing how the lessons of the receipts shaped a new generation? The grandchildren grew up in the shadow of a story they hadn't lived but had inherited. To them, the binder was less about paper and ink than about the quiet force of love that had survived a trial, a rift, and years of silence. They never knew their grandfather the way their parents had, but they carried his lessons as if stitched into their blood. My eldest granddaughter, the one who had toddled through the garden holding her mother's hand, grew into a thoughtful young woman. She studied social work, telling anyone who asked, because families break more than they should, and sometimes they just need someone to remind them how to start again. On the day she graduated, she asked her mother to bring the binder. She tucked her diploma inside it, between a hospital bill and an orthodontist receipt, as if to say, asterisk, his sacrifices made this possible. Asterisk, my son's boy took a different path. He became a carpenter, working with his hands like his father, like me. On the day he opened his own workshop, he built a cabinet for his mother glove. Leaves receipts. Asterisk, she cried when she discovered it. And the youngest of the grandchildren, barely old enough to remember me, carried the binder like a talisman. She flipped through its pages often, not fully understanding the meaning of every bill or note, but feeling the weight of history in her hands. As she grew older, she began to write her own entries, journal pages, sketches, even receipts from little gifts she bought for friends. Someday, she said, my kids will know I loved them too, just like Grandpa wanted you to know. The Siblincy children who once sued their father grew closer through their own children. Time softened their wounds, and the binder became less about proof of debt and more about proof of resilience. They still argued sometimes, as familias do, but their arguments no longer carried the venom of old. Instead, they ended with laughter, or hugs, or quiet apologies. One autumn evening, decades after my passing, they all gathered in the garden once more. The grandchildren grown now, with children of their own sat. At the same weathered table where I had once laid out the binder in defense, the porch light still burned, maintained faithfully by my youngest. Its glow a constant across generations. They opened the binder together, its pages fragile but intact. My granddaughter read aloud one of my old letters, her voice breaking as she spoke the words. Asterisk, you were always worth it. Asterisk. Round her cousins nodded, some crying softly, some smiling through the tears. Then, in a gesture no one planned, each of them placed something new inside. A school report card, a wedding invitation, a sonogram photo, a faded concert ticket. One by one, they added to the collection, transforming it from a record of sacrifice into a living legacy of love. The binder, once a weapon in a courtroom, had become a family's heartbeat proof, not of what had been lost, but of what had been saved. And as the porch light glowed against the night, the next generation understood what their parents had learned too late. Love isn't always loud, or perfect, or even obvious. Sometimes, love is just the quiet persistence of someone who keeps the receipts, not to demand repayment, but to make sure the story is never forgotten. That night, as laughter and stories spilled into the dark, the house was no longer haunted by absence. It was full of voices, of warmth, of generations bound, not by money, but by the proof of devotion that had outlasted everything. The lights stayed on, not for me anymore, but for them, for all of them, and all who would come after. Because love leaves receipts, and this family, finally, had learned how to keep them the right way. Would you like me to end the saga here as a full-circle generational close, or expand even further into how those great-grandchildren interpret the binder in a world their great-grandfather never lived to see? By the time the great-grandchildren were old enough to ask questions, the binder had become almost mythical. It sat in the living room of the old house, still cared for by my youngest daughter until her passing, and then by her nieces and nephews. No one dared to move it. No one dared to hide it. It was treated less like a stack of old papers, and more like a sacred heirloom, a thread tying together for generations. The great-grandchildren would gather around it during family gatherings, running their small fingers across the worn leather cover. Why does everyone cry when they read from it? One asked once, her voice tinged with the unfiltered curiosity only a child can have. Her mother, my granddaughter, knelt beside her and whispered, because it reminds us of love. Not the easy kind, the hard kind. The hard kind, the kind you don't always see until it's gone. As they grew, the children began to understand. The binder wasn't just about groceries or tuition. It was about sacrifice, about the invisible ways love is paid for in time, in effort, in nights without sleep. They read the letters I left behind, my handwriting shaky but fierce, and they absorbed the story of a man they had never met but who had shaped their lives all the same. One great grandson, bright, height. Restless decided to digitize the binder for a school project. He scanned every receipt, every photo, every letter, and created a digital archive. When he presented it to his class, he didn't talk about money or inheritance. He said, "This is proof my family almost broke apart because they forgot love. But it's also proof that we put it back together." His teacher cried. Another great-grandchild, an artist, began to sketch scenes inspired by the binder her grandfather and father building the greenhouse, her mother laughing in the garden, a porch light glowing against the night. She turned the binder into a visual story, painted on canvases that hung in the family home. Each brushstroke carried a truth she never experienced firsthand, but somehow felt in her bones. The house itself became a gathering place for reunions. Every holiday, every milestone, the family returned to its worn floors and glowing porch light. The garden bloomed under new hands, each generation planting something of their own. Tomatoes, corn, beans, flowers every row. A continuation of the legacy I began with calloused hands and weary bones. One summer evening, long after the binder had grown too thick to close properly, the family sat on the porch as fireflies sparked across the yard. A great-granddaughter, barely 16, opened the binder and read aloud from one of my old letters. Asterisk love leaves receipts. Not for you to repay, but for you to remember. Asterisk, she closed it gently and looked at her cousins. So we keep adding to it, right? We don't let it end with us. And they all nodded, solemn but determined. Generations had passed since the trial, since the bitterness, since the fracture that nearly destroyed us. But in that moment, under the soft glow of the porch light, the youngest among them understood the truth that had taken so long to surface. Love survives not by being perfect, but by being remembered. The binder was no longer mine. It belonged to them too, all of Team, and to all who would come after. And as they laughed and shared stories late into the night, the house that had once been a battlefield of silence was now a sanctuary of voices, bound together by one enduring truth. Love leaves receipts. And this family, generation after generation, had finally learned to treasure them. Would you like me to asterisk end the saga here, asterisk as a multi-generational legacy tale, or expand into a asterisk far future? Glimpse asterisk, showing how the binder becomes a symbol even beyond the familia story told to strangers' communities, maybe even the world. Time has a way of carrying stories further than anyone ever intends. What began as a stack of receipts in a weary father-esque binder slowly transformed into something larger than the family itself. By the time the great-grandchildren grew into adults, the binder had become a legend not just within the household, but in the town. Neighbors had heard whispers about it how one family nearly tore itself apart in court, only to be stitched back together by pages of sacrifice. It began with small things. The family brought the binder to community events, sharing excerpts during church gatherings, local history nights, even schools. Children listened wide-eyed as they heard how groceries, hospital bills, and school feast things their parents grumbled about everyday war. Once a father's battlefield of love, teachers began inviting the family to speak about it during lessons on family, forgiveness, and resilience. One winter, a local newspaper ran a feature titled Asterisk, the binder that saved a family. Asterisk, the article spread beyond the town, picked up by regional outlets, then national ones. Reporters marveled at the idea that something as mundane as receipts could carry such weight. Commentators debated whether the story was about money, about parenting, or were about redemption. Letters poured in from strangers who saw their own families mirrored in the tale. A college professor reached out to the family, asking permission to use the binder as part of a course on ethics, family law, and reconciliation. Soon after, the binder was invited to be displayed at a small museum, under glass, but never locked away. Always returned to the family when they asked for it back. People from other towns came to see it, not because of the faded ink or crumbling paper, but because of what it represented. Love documented, love nearly lost, love At first, the family worried it would cheapen the memory, turning something sacred into spectacle. But then, one spring, after a lecture, a young man approached the family. Tears streaked his face as he said, "I haven't spoken to my father in 5 years. Tonight, I'm going to call him, because if you could find your way back, maybe we can too." And that was when the family realized it was a mirror for anyone who had ever misunderstood love, or taken sacrifice for granted, or walked away when they should have stayed. Years passed, and the world changed, technology advancing, lives moving faster than ever. Paper receipts became rare, replaced by digital trails, but the binder remained, heavy with its original pages, layered with new ones. Photographs, letters, emails printed out, drawings from children and grandchildren who wanted to add their mark to the story. Eventually, one of the great-grandchildren published a book. Asterisk Love Leaves. Receipts, asterisk, wasn't just the story of the lawsuit or the reconciliation. It was the saga of the family across generations, woven with lessons about sacrifice, forgiveness, and the invisible ways love endures. The book spread far beyond what anyone expected. Families wrote to say they started keeping their own binders, not of money, but of moments, letters, journals, tokens of love too, ensure their children never forgot. And in the old house, where the porch light still glowed faithfully every night, the binder rested in its rightful place, not as evidence, not as debt, but as a beacon. A reminder, promise, the great-grandchildren, too young to remember the courtroom or the man who kept those receipts, would gather around the table and ask, "Why did he save all this?" And their parents would answer, "Because he wanted us never to forget." Because love isn't invisible, it leaves traces, proof that it was always there, even when we didn't see it. The porch light shone across generations, a steady glow against the night, and long after the man who kept the receipts was gone, his story lived, and not just in his family, but in countless others who learned from it. In the end, the receipts had outlived the courtroom, bitterness, even the man who saved them. They had become what he always hoped they would be, undeniable proof that love, though costly, is priceless. And so the light stayed, and not just for his family anymore, but for the world. Expand even further into a far future vision, asterisk, 100 or 200 years later, where the binder becomes almost a historical or cultural relic, a symbol people look back on to understand family and sacrifice in a different age. In the end, what began as a father's desperate attempt to defend himself in a courtroom became something far greater than he ever imagined. The binder of receipts, once wielded as evidence, once resented as a weapon, transformed into a legacy of remembrance. It carried his love through generations, teaching his children, grandchildren, and even strangers that sacrifice is not weakness, and that love, though flawed and imperfect, always leaves its mark. The family, once broken by greed and misunderstanding, found its way back, not to the innocence of what was lost, but to the strength of what was rebuilt. And as the porch light glowed faithfully through the years, it stood as a symbol of his devotion, a steady flame reminding them that love, even when unseen, is never absent. The receipts proved what words had failed, that every choice, every struggle, every sacrifice was born of love. And that love, though costly, is the only inheritance that truly endures. So the story closes not in bitterness, but in light, proof that even the deepest wounds can give way to healing. And that love, once remembered, can outlast everything.